world is in the grip of an energy crisis, the like of which hasn't been seen since the 1970s. From Britain to China, Europe to South America, countries are facing an energy crunch as the supply of natural gas, oil, coal and other energy sources is failing to meet the demand. The shortages have led to skyrocketing prices. In Europe, natural gas prices have soared 600% since the beginning of the year. The United States has seen a 112% increase in natural gas prices since January. And in the UK, the price of wholesale gas has caused several smaller energy providers to collapse, halting production in some industries. The crisis has extended well beyond natural gas. The shift to oil after gas became scarce has sent oil prices soaring as well. In recent weeks, oil prices have surged above $80 a barrel, the highest point in years. Coal prices have also been rising and supplies are short, creating a power supply crunch, particularly in Asia, which is the largest consumer of coal by region. In just over 6 months, coal prices have quadrupled in the international market. So what led to this energy disruption? How will the situation stabilize? What will be the implications of the current crisis on the transition to renewables? And what kind of transformation should the world look at which ensures energy security, energy equity, and energy sustainability? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena. You're watching Sansad TV. A distinguished panel of experts join us on the global debate to discuss the crisis, the challenges, and the way forward for how the world can achieve a sustainable energy future. Dr. Peter Zeniewski, Senior Analyst, World Energy Outlook, International Energy Agency, joins us from Paris. From New York is Mr. Philippe Benoit, Adjunct Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University, CEPA. And Mr. Upendra Tripathy, former and founding Director General at the International Solar Alliance. He joins us from New Delhi. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the global debate on Sansad TV. Mr. Benoit, let me get the opening remark from you on the discussion. So, two differing views have emerged from the current global energy crisis. One that believes that energy transition by far has not been smooth and there is need to rethink the strategy, one that takes factors like affordability and reliability into consideration, while the other view is that the transition has not happened soon enough. So as an energy expert, how do you look at the ongoing energy crisis worldwide? How do you think it is going to stabilize in the near future?
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here to discuss this issue, in particular on this particular station, given the important role that India plays today in our energy context, but I think more importantly, the increasingly important role that India is going to play in the future. I think there are a couple of important points in terms of the issues that you raised. The first thing is that any energy transition, any appropriate energy transition, needs to not only look at issues of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, but needs to take into account the issues of access and affordability. What we need in an appropriate energy transition is one in which we succeed not only in decarbonizing our energy sector, but promoting the poverty alleviation and economic growth that is critical to getting us to where we need to be. And obviously, this is an important challenge facing India, but also facing other countries as well. I think one thing that has been kind of interesting, to be frank, in terms of the discussion around the current energy crises that various parts of the world are facing is the tendency to want to ascribe what I feel is really too much responsibility, too much blame to the energy transition. And one of the reasons I say that is that if you look at the data, including some of the data that was just released by the IEA under the World Energy Outlook 2021, is what you see is that the world has actually not changed that much in terms of the energy mix over the last 5 years or over the last 10 years. So in some ways, I feel that to a certain extent, it's probably a little premature to ascribe some of the issues that we're facing, high energy prices in Europe, potential coal shortage and electricity shortage in Asia, to the energy transition. We have lived through energy crises in the past, if we think about what happened last year or even before that, and we didn't immediately jump to the energy transition. I think one reason maybe there's a tendency to jump to it right now is because we happen to be heading into the COP season. We've had a variety of important announcements made in terms of increasing ambition, but those have yet really to take hold in terms of our energy system.
Dr. Zeniewski, so obviously the energy crisis is having visible impact socially and economically. We're witnessing markets worldwide are volatile. Countries are staring at a bleak winter ahead. But do you also see it having any kind of implication on the transition process, on the energy transition to renewables?
Well, thank you for having me on, and it's really a great question. And I will feed back to what Philippe was saying about our World Energy Outlook, which was released recently, where we stress quite forcefully that this is not a climate policy issue. It's in fact the opposite. You know, the fuels that are in shortage right now are coal, are gas, and in some respects oil. And that's a broader mismatch between supply and demand. We have to remember that we're in a year where GDP growth is coming back very strongly. There's a recovery from the pandemic, and there's a huge amount of demand for fossil fuels. So if anything, it shows us that rather than blame renewables for the situation we're currently in, it's rather a symptom of the inability of fossil fuels to come in and satisfy the booming demand. So we say this quite clearly because we track the spending and the government sustainability policies, and we note that only 2% of the 17 trillion committed thus far in recovery packages is actually earmarked for cleaner or more resilient systems. So really, it's not a question of too many climate policies, it's too few. And that's something that we see across the spectrum, but certainly also in emerging markets. And you mentioned the question of affordability. And I'd just like to say here that our scenario analysis has shown that actually future commodity price shocks like the one we have today, if we move more rapidly to a clean energy transition, then those kinds of shocks will be less felt by households. There'll be less direct use of oil, gas, and coal by consumers, and that will absorb and cushion some of the shocks that we might experience in future. Now, a lot of that depends on government support. So households need support to have more efficient equipment. They need to transition to electric forms of mobility and to move away from gas, and that's not easy to do. And in the meantime, as Philippe says, we certainly need to invest in resilience. We need to be able to value capacity rather than just energy, so that our infrastructure can cope with seasonal or short-term deficits in supply. And all that becomes very, very important as we add more electricity, as households become more wealthy and buy appliances like air conditioners. All of that comes together and shows us that we really need to invest in the resilience of a clean energy system rather than stop investing in it altogether.
Absolutely. Mr. Tripathy, what do you think? Because when we talk about energy transition, what's even more important is energy access. This is something that we've been talking about in terms of reliability as well. Solar power is something that India has been pitching for. This is one energy that needs to be harnessed. And with this, India initiated the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative with the United Kingdom. In fact, both prime ministers are set to launch this Green Grids initiative, the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative. How significant do you think is this? Because it's the first of its kind global solar network. And what kind of impact do you see it making in terms of access and equity that we've spoken about?
So well, I'm very optimistic about both these initiatives. Green Grid initiative mostly was started by the Climate Parliament in the UK. And One Sun, One World, One Grid that came in 2018 from Prime Minister Modi. Now, both these combined together in Glasgow, we are trying to implement or bring in three elements to the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement: the skill, scale, and speed. So any transition we are talking about, to make it all inclusive, to make it affordable, we have to have these three elements: the speed. That is where you said some feel that it is not fast enough, and there are two schools. And the skill sets with which the politics, the economics, and other social factors move, and scale. Scale is quite important. But if you look at India, the way it talks about the real thing, the common but differentiated responsibility, looking at its historical contribution. But if you look at the other side, what India has done, the only country that put a lot of coal tax, carbon tax, and if you look at even the per capita consumption, it's called poor per capita energy consumption in India. India's consumption is 1/3 of the global consumption, in per capita terms, 1/6 that of China, 1/12 that of USA. And given all that factors, India's initiative of establishing the International Solar Alliance, B, proposing even a World Solar Bank in the ISA General Assembly last time, and C, the huge target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. So all these things put together, you find India moving really in the desired direction to bring in what we call to address not only energy security issue but also climate security. Another issue India is addressing, which is equally important. If you look at the generation of electricity, the energy efficiency programs, the amount of energy that we save globally is just equal to the amount of energy we are producing from renewable energy, which means that technologies are going to play a very critical role. And John Kerry rightly pointed out that 50% of these CO2 friendly or low carbon technologies are in the lab. So next few years or next decade is going to be very critical because the green hydrogen thing is coming up in various countries. India itself has launched a green hydrogen mission.
Mr. Benoit, how much potential do you see in green hydrogen? Because that is one area where a lot of countries are now pinning their hopes. So when we discuss energy mix, green hydrogen is something which is being described as the fuel of the future.
So I think green hydrogen clearly has a potential to be an important part of our future. It's uncertain whether it will be able to achieve that potential. And that's why what we need to do right now is to continue the work to, on the one hand, reduce the cost of producing green hydrogen, setting up and exploring how we can establish the type of distribution systems that will be required to make green hydrogen available not only to larger industrial users, but also to retail. So there are a variety of challenges that we face in enabling green hydrogen to fulfill its promise, and it's very important that we start now. But I think it's also indicative of part of the issue that we see sometimes when we're talking about the energy transition. Just to come back to a point I raised earlier, there are a lot of announcements, a lot of recent announcements. Those announcements have yet to be implemented and to actually have a major impact on our energy system going forward. So I think it's very important that we separate the difference between, I don't want to say rhetoric because it isn't quite rhetoric, but announcements and what is actually happening on the ground. And you raised the important point about financing, if I could just touch on that issue. In order to translate these announcements into a changed reality on the ground, financing will be critical. International financing, yes, but also domestic financing.
Absolutely.
India is growing. It is about to become the 5th largest economy in the world. It's very important that we emphasize it's not simply a question of trying to raise financing from abroad, but also being more effective and efficient in using the wealth that India has domestically to support its own energy transition.
Dr. Zeniewski, obviously different countries have different problems, but the global problem largely is the same. When we talk about energy security, ensuring energy equity as well around the globe, and at the same time realizing the vision of a green and clean future. And that's where a common solution has to be looked at to this very, very common problem.
Yes, that's absolutely right, and this is something that we recognize at the IEA. We've done several reports that identify financing clean transitions in emerging and developing economies as one of the key sort of potential fault lines in the whole clean energy debate, and that's why we explore this issue, looking at all sectors, all fuels, and all technologies, because ultimately the reality is that it's very difficult from a financing point of view to separate clean and dirty. There's often not this kind of very neat categorization of investments. So often you're looking at fertilizer companies that want to improve their efficiency. You're looking at the acceleration of electric vehicles, but that relies on a clean electricity mix. So you're looking at a very sort of murky middle ground where financing the way that ESG conditions and financing is evolving now could, in fact, crowd out some of that investment that's required in that middle ground. And in the IEA's recent outlook, we identify that roughly half of the total investments required over the next decade don't fit neatly into clean versus dirty. That they're either contingent, they need to rely on system change in other parts of the energy sector, or they require investment in things like coal to gas switching or in efficiency improvements and so on. And so one of the key challenges in the emerging world is the cost of capital and the counterparty risks in some of the development models. And those are addressed across the spectrum by development finance institutions, by global multilateral development banks, and so on. And these can help catalyze the private sector investment that's needed. Because another aspect to this is that roughly 70% of the total financing required in a transition to net zero has to come from private sources. And those private sources would invest if there's a reliable policy underpinning for that capital to flow in, if there's a minimization of counterparty risk, and that there's a trusted, bankable pipeline of clean energy projects. And we're not quite there yet, but I'm hoping that Glasgow and COP26 does lay that groundwork that's so necessary to get that money flowing to the developing world.
Absolutely. Mr. Tripathy, that's very, very essential, because the modern technologies, when we talk about switching or transiting to clean energy, the technological know-how must be shared with the developing world in order to bridge that gap. But unfortunately, in the real scenario, things are very, very different. We've just been through a pandemic, a common global problem, which required a shared solution, which were the vaccines. And what we saw worldwide was, on the contrary, the developed world stockpiled vaccines while the developing world was left on its own to fend for itself. And the situation remains pretty similar even today. So how do we look at shared solutions when we talk about a larger energy transition from fossil fuels to green energy?
From Montreal Protocol days, the technology has been an issue. How you get right and appropriate technologies to address climate issues in developing and LDCs. This is this actually is a big issue, because at the field level you find that starting from R&D, the patenting system, the type of exchange technologies, the cost, the royalties, the flow of technologies is a very complex thing, and it's a good thing now that it is attracting a lot more attention compared to earlier days after Paris Agreement. And these issues need to be addressed if we want both energy security and climate security to be ensured. In fact, I remember Mr. Piyush Goyal, who was my minister when I was Vice Minister in the Center as Secretary, Minister of New and Renewable Energy. He would say the per capita coal consumption of India today is somewhat, it was in the developed world some 150 years back. But this is not the time, as I told you, to address individual issues. The time is a common global challenge. And that has to be addressed with speed, skill, and scale. And this involves the issues of technology, issues of capital, issues of free mobility of labor or skills. So it needs but I'm very happy to say that the COP21 and since then things are moving in a good way. The world is getting more and more sensitive towards these needs. And if you see the push at Glasgow, quite a few things are coming, and the very fact that the Indian Prime Minister is going there, and they're coming with the UK to announce not only the Green Grid initiative, but the One Sun, One World Grid, One Grid. These things indicate that we are on the right path, but what we need is perhaps to give a better momentum to the issues of skill, scale, and speed.
Speed is of utmost importance because, of course, the clock is ticking away. The world is running against time to meet the climate targets. Coming back to the current crisis, Mr. Benoit, another huge challenge which the ongoing crisis has shown us, and it is in fact affecting the energy paradigm as well, is related to energy storage. So while renewables, when we talk about solar and wind energy, they're clean, green, widely adopted as well, and now quite affordable, but it is intermittent and also unstable. So what needs to be done to strengthen storage options of these sources of energy?
Well, that's absolutely right. Storage is a critical issue when we think about renewables. And obviously, there's been a lot of technological improvements in the issue of storage. I think in some ways reflecting the fact that people have recognized that we need to think more deeply about this and make more efforts to innovate in the area of storage. But I will say two things. There's the issue of storage, but there's also the way you manage your overall grid. There are a variety of different sources of renewables that you can deploy in a way to basically compensate for some of the storage challenges. One thing that's interesting about storage when it comes to renewables is we've had storage for many, many years, for decades. We've had that in the case of hydropower, where basically you pump water up a certain level, and then when you need it, you let it flow down, and it generates electricity. When you look at all of the projections in terms of where we're heading in terms of storage, you see we're all very, very optimistic about the ability to substantially reduce the cost of battery storage and to find other technologies. But how you manage your grid in an integrated manner in which you have a lot more renewables is also another way to improve the reliability and the availability of renewables. And if I could just make one last comment in that regard, and I think it's something that's often overlooked when we think about security. Solar is domestically produced energy. It does not rely on price variations. It does not involve geopolitical issues that may be happening in the Middle East or somewhere else that will affect oil prices or gas prices. Renewables tend to be domestic energy resources. And in some ways, when we project into the future, a system where you have a lot more reliable renewables, where you have good storage systems, good diversification, that actually can potentially provide a much more secure, stable, predictable energy system than one in which you have to rely on a lot of fossil fuel imports, where the price is often not determined by what's happening within your own country, but by what's happening abroad.
Absolutely. Very, very significant point made by Mr. Benoit. Mr. Tripathy, let me get in a quick comment from you on the kind of geopolitics scenario that Mr. Benoit mentioned and the impact that it has on the energy cycle. So when we switch towards renewables, and particularly when we talk about this transnational solar grid that India and the UK are pitching for, it is also going to end this monopoly that certain countries enjoy?
Well, that's a very good point. In fact, one of the, a part of the One Sun, One World, One Grid is that it also envisages a sort of political treaty among UN member countries. Given that, the climate security is very important, given that green energy is essential, it's a part of that. In fact, geopolitical risk management is going to be a part of the charter. If you look at, there are many countries in the region, in the world, many regions where, they do discuss about free energy exchanges. Like if you look at even South Asia, India and Bangladesh, India and Bhutan, they have done. And I recently came to know about a company in Australia, which is putting some 7,000, plan to put, I think it has run some problem, but 7,000 kilometers of transmission of solar energy from Australia to Singapore via Indonesia. and it was supposed to be cheaper than what is the current rate in Singapore is. Some of it is said, the world is moving in the right direction, except that we have to gather a lot more momentum in terms of speed, skill, and scale. And I also made the point that for Glasgow, the policies that we make for energy security and climate security are critical. They both are intertwined. And disaster management is going to play increasingly bigger role in ensuring energy security and climate security both.
Dr. Zeniewski, the IEA had said earlier this year that no new oil and natural gas fields are needed in the net zero pathway. But the current crisis that we're in, we're now seeing Europe turning back to nuclear power, and the countries even want it to be classified as green energy. So to necessitate more stable, complementary resources to plug the demand-supply gap that we are witnessing, how feasible, according to you, is this move to turn back towards nuclear? And what does it mean in the longer run for climate-friendly transformation?
At the IEA, our approach has always been to promote all fuels and all technologies for the clean energy transition. And certainly, nuclear has certain advantages, if it's well managed and if there's proper sort of safety measures put in place. And certainly there's an essential role in the net zero scenario, not just for new nuclear facilities, but also for existing ones to be refurbished and to have their lifetimes extended. That really forms a very important part of clean energy transitions. And the reason for that is that nuclear is a baseload technology. It can provide power practically more or less on demand. And as Philippe mentioned, as we progress further into the clean energy transition, that will become a premium. The ability to call on fuels when you need them in the backdrop of variable solar and wind generation is going to be very, very valuable.
Absolutely. So as countries head to meet at the COP26, Mr. Benoit, so what is the kind of focus that you think will be at COP26?
As we head into COP, what we're seeing is an increasing recognition worldwide of the climate imperative. But it's also important to not forget the development imperative, the issue that you have been talking about, providing access to those who don't have access, but not simply that, providing the means so that we can raise people out of poverty, so people can move from the working class to the middle class, which is going to be so critical to providing sustained, robust growth in India and in other developing countries. So as we head into COP, it's important to remember that we will not achieve our climate imperative if we don't satisfy the development imperative. And at the same time, it's important for developing countries and other countries to realize that we won't achieve our development imperative in a sustainable manner if we don't deal with the climate issue. So at COP, it's critical that both advanced economies, the richer countries, and the developing countries bear in mind that we need to find ways to satisfy both objectives.
So a clean and green future is a shared vision, and therefore a coordinated response is needed to fulfill this vision. Developed countries must share the modern technologies and the know-how to ensure that there is equity with security, something that our panelists have also suggested. With that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of the Global Debate. Thank you very much to all our panelists for joining us on the program today and sharing your thoughts on this very, very important subject with us and our viewers. Pleasure having you on the program on Sansad TV. Thank you very much once again for joining us on the program. And thank you very much to our viewers as well for their time. See you again next time. Thank you once again.